Picture this. You're living in the 11th century, a time when London's population was a mere 15,000 people, a far cry from the 9 million we see today. The 11th century, a period often referred to as the Dark Ages, was a time of significant change. Towns and cities were not the bustling metropolises we're familiar with today. In fact, they were more akin to small villages, with most people living in rural areas tending to their fields and livestock. The general population was considerably smaller than it is today. For instance, consider London, the capital city of England. Back then it was home to just 15,000 people. Compare that to the present day where London's population is well into the millions. Now let's discuss the social hierarchy, an integral part of life in the 11th century. Society was structured according to the feudal system, a hierarchical order that was the bedrock of medieval Europe. At the top of this pyramid sat the king, followed by the nobles, knights, and then the peasants. This system was not just about status, it dictated every aspect of daily life, from where one lived to one's duties and responsibilities. The king, as the ruler of the land, granted estates to his most loyal nobles in exchange for their military service. These nobles, in turn, provided land to the knights, who served as their protectors. At the bottom of the hierarchy were the peasants, also known as serfs. They worked the land, providing food and other resources to those above them in the social order. Feudalism was more than just a social structure, it was a way of life, a system that provided stability and order in a time of constant upheaval and uncertainty. Despite its apparent harshness, it was the glue that held society together, providing everyone with a role and a purpose. So, life in the 11th century was vastly different from today, with people living in small communities and a social hierarchy that dictated every aspect of daily life. Did you know that honey was a common remedy for a variety of ailments in the 11th century? Yes, the sweet nectar we drizzle on our pancakes was once considered a potent medicine. It's just one of the many fascinating aspects of medicine during the medieval times. In the 11th century, medical knowledge was limited, and explanations for disease often leaned towards the supernatural. People believed that illnesses were punishments from God or the work of evil spirits. As a result, treatments often involved prayer, ritual, and penance. The church played a significant role in healthcare, with monks and nuns providing care for the sick and injured within monastic infirmaries. But it wasn't all spiritual. There was also a reliance on the natural world for cures. Herbal remedies were commonplace. Plants like sage, lavender, and chamomile were regularly used to treat a range of conditions. For example, sage was often used to soothe sore throats, while lavender was believed to alleviate headaches. Honey, as mentioned earlier, was used for its antiseptic properties to treat wounds and prevent infection. Yet, without an understanding of bacteria or viruses, these treatments were hit and miss. Some remedies did work, thanks to the natural properties of the herbs and substances used. Many others, however, were downright dangerous. Bloodletting, for instance, was a popular treatment for various ailments. This practice involved cutting a patient to let out bad blood, a concept we now know to be flawed and potentially fatal. Then there were the more bizarre treatments. To cure a toothache, one might be advised to kiss a donkey. If you were suffering from rheumatism, wearing a bag of chicken bones around your neck was considered a viable treatment. So while we may laugh at some of the more unusual remedies, it's important to remember that these were people doing their best with the knowledge they had. They were pioneers in their own right, laying the groundwork for the modern medical practices we benefit from today. Their curiosity and experimentation, however misguided at times, ultimately led us to the advanced healthcare we now enjoy. Bathing in the 11th century was not a daily routine, but a luxury only for the rich. This was an era when cleanliness was not synonymous with daily life. Rather, it was a privilege enjoyed by the upper echelons of society, a luxury that was often beyond the reach of the common folk. During this period, people would bathe in wooden tubs or wash basins, sometimes even in local rivers or streams. Bathing was not a regular practice, but rather a communal event often tied to religious festivals or celebrations. The water was usually heated over a fire and then poured into the tub, a process that was both time-consuming and resource-intensive. As for clothing, it was typically made of wool or linen. Clothes were not washed frequently, but when they were, it was usually in a communal setting, with the garments being beaten on rocks or scrubbed with sand to remove dirt and grime. It's also worth noting that the concept of underwear was non-existent during this period. Instead, people wore a long linen shirt or chemise that served the dual purpose of providing some level of comfort and absorbing body oils. In terms of food, meals were typically hearty, often comprising bread, cheese, and ale. Meat was a luxury usually reserved for the wealthy or for special occasions. Most people subsisted on a diet of grains, vegetables, and dairy products. While modern conveniences like soap and toothpaste were not yet invented, people of the 11th century turned to nature for their hygiene needs. Sand was used as a sort of scouring agent to clean pots and pans, while herbs like mint and sage were used to freshen breath and clean teeth. Other plants such as lavender and rosemary were used for their pleasant smells and were often strewn on the floors of homes to mask unpleasant odors. So while the 11th century might not have had the conveniences we enjoy today, it's clear that people of this era had their own ways of maintaining cleanliness. They made do with what they had and used the resources at their disposal to ensure a level of hygiene that was acceptable for their time. Despite the lack of modern conveniences, people in the 11th century had their own unique ways of maintaining cleanliness. In the 11th century, the church wasn't just a place of worship, it was the heart of the community. Its influence permeated every aspect of daily life and was deeply embedded in the societal fabric of the time. Religion was not a mere aspect of life, it was life itself. The church was the epicenter of power, a hub of authority that transcended the temporal and the spiritual. It was a source of guidance, providing moral compass to the society of the time. The church held the keys to heaven and hell, and it was the clergy who, acting as intermediaries, could either pave the way to salvation or damnation. Religious holidays punctuated the calendar year, bringing respite from the toil of everyday life. These holidays or holy days were not merely days of rest, they were days of celebration, of communal gathering, and of reinforcing the societal bonds that held communities together. From Christmas to Easter, these occasions were marked with feasting, processions, and most importantly, religious ceremonies. But beyond the pomp and pageantry, these holy days served a deeper purpose. They were constant reminders of the ever-present concept of sin and salvation. Every act, every decision was viewed through the lens of its potential to lead to salvation or sin. This belief was not just a deterrent for immoral acts, but also a motivator for good deeds. It was a system of moral checks and balances, with the promise of heavenly rewards and the threat of eternal damnation serving as the ultimate motivators. The concept of sin and salvation was not confined to the spiritual realm. It was a tangible force that shaped laws, influenced decisions, and dictated daily routines. The church, with its moral and spiritual authority, was the force that held this complex system in balance. In essence, the 11th century was a time when religion was not just a belief, but a way of life. It was an era where the church was not just a building, but the cornerstone of society. Religion was a vital part of life in the 11th century, influencing everything from laws to daily routines. The 11th century, a time of knights, castles, and a world very different from our own. The medieval period, often referred to as the Dark Ages, was a time of significant transformation in Britain. The social structure was predominantly feudal, with the king at the helm, followed by the nobility, knights, and the peasantry, who made up the majority of the population. Medieval medicine was an intriguing blend of ancient knowledge, superstition, and religious belief. Physicians were scarce, and most people relied on herbal remedies, superstitions, and prayers for healing. Despite the lack of modern medical knowledge, they managed to survive using these rudimentary practices. Daily life and hygiene were, well, not quite as we know them today. Baths were taken infrequently, and people used herbs and flowers to mask odors. Clothes were worn for many days before being washed, and homes were heated by open fires, which meant they were often filled with smoke. Despite these conditions, people found joy in simple pleasures such as feasting, storytelling, and music. Religion played a pivotal role in the 11th century. The church was the most powerful institution and greatly influenced all aspects of life. It provided spiritual guidance, education, and was a source of community and cultural life. Monasteries served as centers of learning, preserving knowledge and texts during this period. Life in the 11th century was not easy by any stretch of the imagination, but it was a time of great change and development. People were innovative, resilient, and found ways to survive and even thrive in their challenging environment. They worked hard, but they also knew how to celebrate and enjoy life, despite the hardships. People in the 11th century lived full and vibrant lives, leaving a lasting legacy that still influences our world today. They were the architects of the foundations upon which our modern society was built, and for that we owe them a debt of gratitude.